Hello, my name is Lukazs Kaminski. I am historian at the University of Wrocław. My main research field is resistance against the communist system in East Central Europe. I am also interested in memory studies, how the communist system is now remembered and also memorialized. I'm going to speak today about the most important events in the post-war history of the Soviet bloc, which were the crises of the system. The first one appeared in 1956, especially in Hungary, 1968, and it was about Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring, finally 1980 and creation of Solidarity movement in Poland. All those factors led to the final act, 1989, Autumn of Nations, when altogether we were able to change the system in our part of Europe. Why did people oppose communism? The reasons were diverse, but the most important were lack of freedom, of justice, of truth and independence, together with low standard of life. When we are thinking about lack of freedoms, first we think about freedom of speech, of association, freedom of political opinion, conscience and religion. And of course, those freedoms were violated every single day under communist system. But it is also about a kind of minor freedoms, like, for example, freedom to travel. Citizens of the Soviet bloc were not allowed freely to travel even inside the bloc. It was also about, for example, freedom of choosing place to work. Often people were forced to work in the places selected by the state, not by them. Lack of justice was mainly connected with the political trials, with mass repression of people for their opinions not approved by the authorities. But there were also many other kinds of injustice under communist system, like, for example, children were punished with ban on education only because their parents were considered by authorities as enemies of the people. The communist system was based on mass lie. The lies were spread by the propaganda and defended by the censorship. So many people also opposed communists because they wanted more truth in a public life. Most important decisions were taken not in the capital cities on a given communist country, but in Moscow. So for whole nations it was quite offensive in their national feelings. They wanted to be more independent from the Soviet Union. One of the biggest promises of the communist system was to satisfy the basic human needs. In fact, the communist economy was never effective. There were many shortages, even of basic products. We may say that the whole history of post-war communism was a history of one big economic crisis. The opposition against communist system took various forms, from armed struggle to passive resistance, from spreading independent, uncensored information to organizing strike and demonstrations, from individual act of protest to mass rebellion. First mass rebellion occurred in the Soviet bloc just after the death of Stalin in 1953. People expected some changes, some liberalization of the system. Instead of it, they got continuing exploitation. The first revolts appeared in the Soviet Gulag camps. Later on May 1953, there were strikes in Bulgaria. In the beginning of June, also in Czechoslovakia, many strikes and demonstrations were organized. Finally, in the mid-June 1953, citizens of GDR, German Democratic Republic, revolted, and just in a few hours the communist authorities lost control over the situation and the regime was saved only thanks to the bloody intervention of the Soviet army. Those events forced Moscow to change their policy, not only towards GDR and Czechoslovakia, but also Hungary, which was considered as next country to revolt. The changes in Hungary were associated with the name of Imre Nagy, new prime minister, who became a symbol of liberalization, especially in the field of economy. In February 1956, the Soviet Communist Party held its 20th Congress. It was an important event because the new party leader, Nikita Khrushchev, delivered a so-called secret speech, and he denounced some crimes of Stalin. It opened the discussion in the whole Soviet bloc about the Stalinist era and possible changes. Especially tense was the situation in Poland because of death of the local Stalin, the Polish communist leader Bolesław Bierut. After it, parties split into two factions, more reformist and more conservative. And in such situation, on the 28th of June 1956, citizens of a big Polish city, Poznań, revolted. The revolt started with economic demands. They just wanted to improve their social and economic situation. But just in a few hours, they took many political demands, demanding independence from the Soviet Union, free elections, and also return of important political figure from exile. It was pacified with armed force, unfortunately. Army was used, 58 people were killed, but this pacification didn't stop the changes in Poland. The both factions in the Communist Party agreed in one point. They knew that to control situation, they need to find a new leader, and the best candidate for a new leader of the Communist Party was Władysław Gomułka, who was even imprisoned during Stalinist era, so he was quite credible also for the majority of population. And in October 1956, they decided to appoint him as a new first secretary of Polish United Workers' Party. But they met resistance from Moscow. Suddenly, the plane from Moscow landed in Warsaw with Nikita Khrushchev on board, and he started to threaten Polish leaders that they need to change their decisions. In the same time, the Soviet tanks, which were in many garrisons around Poland, started to move towards Warsaw. So we may say that even a kind of military intervention in Poland started. Finally, during the whole night negotiations, Khrushchev agreed for Gomułka as a new leader of the party, but it didn't stop many manifestations, rallies around the country. People demanded more changes, not just a change of the leader, but also some change in the political sphere or in economy. The news from Warsaw traveled around Soviet bloc, and they were the most important for Hungary. In Hungary, especially in Budapest, many circles were already organized and discussing various issues. When they heard about this attempt to intervene in Polish issues by the Soviet leaders, they decided to organize the rally in support of Poles. So on the 23rd of October, almost 200,000 people gathered in the center of Budapest as an act of solidarity with Poles. But soon they started to act in sake of changes in own country. After a few hours, the huge statue of Stalin was thrown down and Hungarian revolution started. People got arms and started to fight against security forces, which were really hated in Hungary. After a few days of heavy fights with participation of the Soviet army, Hungarian communists decided to change the leadership, and they returned to Imre Nagy as a prime minister. So he was able to stop the fights. There was even a withdrawal of Soviet troops from Budapest. Rebellion groups were accepted as a new National Guard of Hungary, and new multi-party government was formed. Nóź promised to the nation free elections, complete change of the system, and on the 1st of November he declared neutrality of Hungary and its withdrawal from Warsaw Pact. Unfortunately for Hungarians, Soviet leadership already decided to again intervene in Hungary, and this part of intervention started on the 4th November 1956. The superiority of Soviet power was overwhelming, so after 1 week of heavy fight, the revolution was ended. Imre Nóź hid in Yugoslav embassy, but later on he was convinced to leave the embassy. He was arrested and sentenced for death. And as many as 230 other people were also executed. The period of mass repression started. So together with 2,700 people who were killed in the fights, the losses were huge. 200,000 people were forced to leave the country. After a few months of repression, situation, according to communist rules, returned to be normal. One of the countries which avoided destalization in 1956 was Czechoslovakia. It started there as late as in 1960, with its peak in 1962, when huge monument of Stalin in Prague was demolished. But it was not enough to solve the country problems. The economic situation was not good, and some groups started to ask for more freedoms, especially among intellectuals and students. Also, one of the problems of the time was the feeling in the Slovak part of the country that the position of Slovaks in a common state is unequal comparing to the Czech part of the common state. It was not only about the society, but also inside the Communist Party. More and more people started to believe that some changes are needed. Finally, in January 1968, new leader of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, Alexander Dubček, was elected. So we may say that the Prague Spring, in fact, started in winter. Party announced a program of reforms, including abolishment of censorship, limiting the powers of security apparatus, and what was also important for the people, removing those affiliated or connected with the Stalinist period from their post. It was also allowed to create new associations, and a few groups became very active during the events. But still, this crisis of the communist system was quite different when we compare it to others, because everything started not with the mass revolt of the population, but rather with reforms imposed by the leadership of the Communist Party. Even in this situation, when everything was still under control of the Communist Party, it was too much for other countries of Warsaw Pact, of the Soviet bloc. Especially the Polish leader, Władysław Gomułka, felt some danger coming from Czechoslovak attempts to reform the system, to build so-called socialism with the human face, because in 1968 also a series of protests appeared at the Polish universities. Finally, in the night of 20th August 1968, the intervention of Warsaw Pact troops started in Czechoslovakia. It met strong resistance, not only from the side of society, but also Communist Party. Communist Party of Czechoslovakia even organized underground congress and called Czechs and Slovaks to protest in the form of strike general against intervention. People who supported intervention were not able to form new government. Eventually, after a few days, the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev decided to start negotiations with Dubček, who was meanwhile imprisoned in the Soviet Union, and other leaders of Prague Spring. They promised him to withdraw from most important reform. Then they returned to the country and asked population to stop resistance against foreign occupation. With time, many groups became disappointed with the situation. They couldn't agree on abandoning the process of the reform. The most active group were students, who even organized a big strike against some changes in the leadership. One of the students who was looking for the best way to protest was Jan Palach. And finally, in January 1969, he decided to sacrifice himself. In the center of Prague, he committed self-immolation and died. Thanks to his act, the resistance became more active for a few weeks, with the last demonstrations in August 1969. But unfortunately, again, because of mass purges, mass repression, because of flight of dozens of thousands of the people from the country, after 2 years, so-called normalization succeeded again. Jan Palach's case was well known not only in the entire world but also inside the Soviet bloc, because even the communist press announced the course of events after his death. But he was not the first one who protested in such a way. The first was Pole, Ryszard Siwiec, who in early September 1968, in the same way in Warsaw, protested against intervention of Warsaw Pact troops in Czechoslovakia. And later on, dozens of people followed their footsteps, and the last acts of self-immolation were recorded in the Soviet Union in 1991, so in the time of its collapse. And one may ask a question: why so many people choose this drastic form of protest? All we know from historical sources shows us that it was in fact not about the protest itself, because there were much more effective ways to protest against the communist system. The main goal of Siwiec, Palach and others was to mobilize others, mobilize the society to resist the communists. They believed that their sacrifice, their pain will leave no choice to other people, that it will be not possible to stay indifferent anymore. Poles were the most rebellious nation in East Central Europe. The protests of 1956 were followed by another in 1968, 1970 and 1976. After the latter, some opposition groups were created, which were strong enough to organize independent manifestation or to print underground magazines. Another important factor was election of Polish Pope John Paul II in October 1978, and especially his first visit in homeland in June 1979. This time, the end of 1970s, was also time of huge economic crisis in Poland. There were shortages of almost everything, from food to medicine, and what we mostly remember from these times are the long lines of people waiting for stuff being delivered to the shop. And in such a situation, in early July 1980, communist authorities decided to increase prices. And because of this, a new wave of strikes appeared. The first strikes were unorganized and quite easy to be stopped by the authorities. They just promised some raises in wages or something like that, and the strikes ended. But with the time, they became more organized. And the crucial point was the 14th of August 1980, when the strike in the Gdańsk shipyard began. And this time it was not about economic situation, rise of prices anymore. It was an act of solidarity with Anna Walentynovich, activist of one of the opposition organizations, who was fired from their work. After a few days, another shipyard center, Szczecin, joined Gdańsk, and later on also important industrial regions of Lower and Upper Silesia. And in this situation, the communist authorities didn't have any other choice but to accept all demands of striking workers, including approval for creation of independent trade unions. The agreement was signed on the 31st August 1980, and in this way the Solidarity Trade Union with its leader Lech Wałęsa was born. It was quite unique situation in the history of the Soviet bloc. For the first time, important independent from the authorities organization was accepted. Soon, Solidarity had almost 10 million members, including other non-communist organizations which were created, like Independent Students' Union or the Union of Farmers. We may say that almost half of society were members of various independent organizations. So this crisis of the communist system became structural in its nature. It was a unique period in the history of Poland, a period of many hopes, of enthusiasm. People really believed that the change is possible. Solidarity prepared many programs of reforms in various fields of life. We may say that Solidarity was a kind of answer to the whole totalitarian communist experience. And for example, if system was based on lack of democracy, Solidarity was a very democratic organization. Sometimes it even caused the problems because some discussions, some internal debates couldn't end. If the communist system was based on lies, Solidarity was promoting the truth. Not only the truth about the current situation, about the economic and political life in Poland, but, for example, also the truth about history. Very active were the teachers of history who prepared the new school curricula and hoped for introducing them during the new school year. Solidarity reached the kind of peak of its history during the first Congress, which was organized in September and October 1981. The main achievement of the Congress was adopting program which we know under the name the Self-Governing Republic. It was a wide program of reforms, program of democratization and liberalization situation in Poland. So it is not surprising that it met propaganda attacks not only from the side of Polish communists, but also other countries of the Soviet bloc. What was the most attacked was a call of Solidarity to other nations in East Central Europe to join the movement. But even if Soviet propaganda heavily attacked the Solidarity, called it counter-revolution, the Soviet took some lessons from the previous events, including intervention in Czechoslovakia. And many Poles, of course, also remembered 1956 in Hungary, 1968 in Czechoslovakia, and this is why people were thinking, where is the line we shouldn't cross to avoid Soviet intervention. So this is the reason why sometimes we call Solidarity self-limiting revolution. But anyway, for the Soviet leaders, it was hard to imagine another armed intervention, this time in Poland. Also because the Soviet troops were active in Afghanistan in the same time. So they forced the Polish communists to use own army against society. And the Polish communists had a choice to accept the program of Solidarity, so in fact accept the fact that there will be a gradual change of the system, or to defend the system. And unfortunately, they decided to not change anything in the communist country. And in December 1981, martial law was introduced in Poland. The Polish crisis, however, ended differently comparing to the previous one. Solidarity survived, despite the dozens of thousands of people being arrested, sentenced for imprisonment, or forced to leave the country. Solidarity and other groups were active in the underground, printing, independent press, organizing strikes, demonstrations. They were even able to organize independent broadcasting, which was a kind of symbol how powerful underground in Poland is. And this prolonging situation of resistance in Poland inspired groups in other countries. Contacts were established with opposition in GDR, in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Many people even visited Poland to learn, for example, how to print in the underground. A specific case is close cooperation of Polish and Czechoslovak opposition. Even a special group called Polish-Czechoslovak Solidarity was created. They were able to meet many times using mountains on the border of both countries. But activity, growing activity of opposition groups in the Soviet bloc was not the only factor of changes. Of course, very important was economic situation, and it became worse and worse in all countries, not only, for example, in Poland and Romania, like it was before. This situation was also connected with the results of the introduction of martial law in Poland, because American authorities decided to introduce sanctions not only against Poland but also against Soviet Union. US government also started new arm race, forcing Soviet Union for a huge effort, and finally Soviets realized that they cannot continue this race against United States. So economy was in a deep crisis, and also there was a huge problem with the oil prices, and export of oil was one of the main sources of income for the Soviet Union. In this situation, new leadership under Mikhail Gorbachev decided to start some reforms. Gorbachev announced uskorienie, so changes in economic system. He announced glasnost, so possibility to speak more freely than before, not only about the current situation, but also about the history, and a huge debate about the Stalinist crimes started in Soviet Union. And finally, he used the famous slogan of perestroika, so general changes, also including the political system. But it was not only internal reforms inside the Soviet Union. He was also ready to allow some changes in other countries of Soviet bloc. The first country which used this opportunity was Poland. After new waves of strikes in 1988, communist government offered solidarity to start roundtable negotiation. As an effect, in June 1989, partially free elections were organized, and soon also the first non-communist Polish government after the Second World War was formed. In the same time, the process of reform also took place in Hungary. Another type of negotiations with opposition started, but also Hungarian government was the first which opened its borders with Austria. So the fall of Iron Curtain began in this way. And it was very important for the citizens of German Democratic Republic, who started to use this opportunity as a possibility to leave the country and join the Western Germany. After a few months, in September and October, mass protests started in the whole GDR. Hundreds of thousands of people participated in the demonstrations, demanding, among others, also opening of German borders. Finally, on the 9th of November, Berlin Wall, which was a huge symbol of division of Europe, fell. Just day after, the long-term communist dictator in Bulgaria, Zhivkov, was removed. And on 17th of November 1989, Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia started. In early 1989, the leader of Czechoslovak opposition, Václav Havel, was imprisoned. And in the last days of 1989, he became the first non-communist president of Czechoslovakia. It's a symbol how fast, how quick the changes were in the whole East Central Europe in 1999. The last remaining communist government among Warsaw Pact countries was Romania. But even there, in late December 1989, the revolution started. Unfortunately, this one was a bloody one. The cost of overthrowing the regime of Ceausescu was over 1,000 human lives. The effect of changes of 1989 was a series of free elections in Central Europe in 1990-1991, the change of political systems, the change of economic system. Finally, in 1991, Warsaw Pact was dissolved. In the same time, many nations inside the Soviet Union also started to protest. They demanded more democracy, and with time, they also demanded national independence. Finally, in December 1999, also the Soviet Union was dissolved, and in the same time, the last communist government in Europe, in Albania, fell. The collapse of the communist system in Central Europe and dissolution of the Soviet Union was the result of many factors, including economy and international situation. But it would never happen without permanent strong resistance from the peoples of Central Europe.